Good morning, everyone. My name is Andre Vincent Henry. I'm the director of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, and it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this morning's webinar as we celebrate International Women's Day. We have a very distinguished panel with us this morning, and my sole obligation this morning is to introduce you to our moderator for today's proceedings. Ms. Sangeeta Bundu is the Senior Legal Officer at the Ministry of Labor in Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Bundu is an attorney who holds a master's in law. And Ms. Bundu is also a key individual. You will forgive me, I can't find my notes. A key individual that ensures that Trinidad and Tobago meets its obligations for good industrial relations practice through the observance of good law. So without further hesitation, I am pleased to introduce you to Ms. Sangeeta Bundu, who will take our proceedings from here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Henry. Good morning, everyone, and I hope everyone is having a beautiful morning this morning as we are joining in this conversation. So my first task this morning is really a privilege. I am able to introduce Her Honor, Mrs. Deborah Thomas Felix. Mrs. Deborah Thomas Felix is the first female president of the Industrial Court of Trinidad and Tobago, and she is currently a judge of the International Monetary Fund Administrative Tribunal. She is also a member of the International Labour Organization's Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations. She served as a judge and the 8th President of the United Nations Appeals Tribunal. She is a former chairman of the Trinidad and Tobago Securities Exchange Commission and is a former chairman of the Caribbean Group of Securities Regulators. Mrs. Thomas Felix is a past president of the Family Court of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and has served as a magistrate, senior magistrate, and deputy chief magistrate of the Judiciary of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Mrs. Thomas Felix is an attorney at law by profession who holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of West Indies, a Certificate of Legal Education, a Master's of Law degree in International Legal Studies from the Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C., USA, and an Executive Master's in Business Administration from the Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business of the University of the West Indies. She is also a certified international arbitration in oil and gas cases, mediation and conciliation. Mrs. Thomas Felix is also the author of the recently published and much needed book, Labor Law in the Commonwealth Caribbean, The Practice of Good Industrial Relations in the 21st Century. And Mrs. Thomas Felix is an inspiration to women. So without further ado, I give the virtual floor to Her Honor.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I will begin by paraphrasing the words of the ILO. Violence and harassment in the world of work deprives people of their dignity, is incompatible with decent work, and is a threat to equal opportunities. This is paid, healthy, and productive working environments. It remains a widespread occurrence, present in all countries and disregarding sectors, occupation, and work arrangements. Convention 190, the Violence and Harassment Convention, along with the Violence and Harassment Recommendation number 206, recognize the right of everyone to a world of work to be free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. This convention potentially will change some of the dynamics in the workplace globally, in that it can shape a future of work based on dignity, respect, and free from violence and harassment. I think it is therefore very important to discuss this convention on International Women's Day. Although I must caution to say, the convention is not about the elimination of violence against women in the workplace, but instead the elimination of all forms of violence and harassment in the world of work, regardless of gender. Convention 190 defines violence and harassment in the world of work as a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated, that aim at, result in, or is likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. Gender-based violence and harassment is specifically highlighted in the convention, and it's defined as violence and harassment directed at persons because of their sex or gender, or affecting persons of a particular sex or gender disproportionately, and includes sexual harassment. The convention also takes into account third parties, for example, clients, customers, service providers, and patients, because they can be victims as well as perpetrators. These definitions potentially cover, among other things, physical abuse, verbal abuse, bullying, sexual harassment, catcalls, threats, and stalking. The convention and its recommendation also consider the nature of the world of work, the erosion of the traditional employment contract, and the fact that nowadays work doesn't always take place in a physical workplace. The aim of the convention is to protect persons in the world of work, including employees, persons working irrespective of their contractual status, persons in training, including interns and apprentices, workers whose employment have been terminated, volunteers, job seekers, and job applicants, and individuals exercising the authority, duties, or responsibilities of an employer. It is important to note that the convention applies to all sectors, whether private or public, both in the formal and informal economy, whether in urban or rural areas. Anyone who works or is working a job is protected, irrespective of contractual status, and includes persons exercising the authority of an employer. Convention 190 applies to violence and harassment in the world of work occurring in the course of, and this is very important, linked with and arising out of work, namely in the workplace, including public and private spaces where they are a place of work, in places where the worker is paid, takes a rest break or a meal, or uses sanitary washing and changing facilities, during work-related trips, travel, training, events, and social activities, through work-related communication, including those enabled by information and communication technology, in employer-provided accommodation, and even when commuting to and from work. A very interesting and important feature of this convention and the recommendations is the impact of domestic violence in the world of work. The convention has taken a significant step to treat with the issue of domestic violence. The recommendations call for member states to take appropriate measures to recognize domestic violence and, so far as is reasonably practicable, mitigate its impact in the world of work. To this end, the recommendation sets out practical measures to protect the victim, while including arrangements for leave, flexible work, and violence awareness are raising through although the violence may not have occurred in the workplace. So it means that the workers and the employers in the Caribbean will now have to look at new ways and think out of the box when they know that there is a victim of domestic violence in the workplace. This is a significant step in bringing domestic violence out of the shadows and encouraging a change of attitude towards this problem. In my view, when a country ratifies this instrument, it is stating very loudly and boldly that violence and harassment will not be tolerated in society. And this is a very powerful message. Convention 190 of 2019 has been ratified by 4 countries so far, namely Uruguay, which was the first to ratify it, Namibia, Fiji, and Argentina. And it comes into force in June 2021. It is the first ever international treaty to regard work-based violence and harassment as human rights violations. No doubt the activism of the trade union movement worldwide and the Me Too movement against gender violence and harassment contributed significantly to the development of this convention, which will become, when it comes into force, an international labor standard. Article 5 of the convention provides, and I quote, "With a view of preventing and eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work, each member should respect, promote, and realize the fundamental principles and rights at work, namely freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect to employment and occupation, as well as to promote decent work," unquote. These provisions support the need for comprehensive legal frameworks and policies in the workplace, which promote effective social dialogue, freedom of association, and collective bargaining in order to tackle the problems of violence and harassment in the workplace. In small island states such as the Caribbean, we must always have mechanisms for the continuous examination of the laws and legal framework with a view to identifying areas for change. Violence and harassment at work must be a front burner item in decision making when we are drafting legislation for the workplace. Those who govern must not only declare zero tolerance to violence and harassment in the workplace, but must also ratify Convention 190 as a matter of urgency and create policies within their countries which make domestic violence shelters, hospitals, public education, and women's healthcare priorities, which attract the same type of injection of funding as do bridges, highways, roads, and stadia. It is my belief that only with the implementation and practice of comprehensive policies which treat with the fundamental principles and rights at work for all, that the provisions of Convention 190 can flourish and become a beacon for the future of work and for the practice of good industrial relations globally. The ILO has dedicated a significant portion of its mandate over the past 102 years to combating discrimination in every form. Foremost among those is gender-based inequities. The work of the ILO brings into focus the importance of creating options for women, and in so doing, facilitating the enjoyment of choice, which is central to true empowerment. From the Equal Remuneration Convention in 1951, the Discrimination Convention in 1958, the Workers with Families Responsibilities Convention in 1981, the Maternity Protection Convention in 2000, the landmark Domestic Workers Convention in 2011, to the Social Protection Floors Recommendation in 2012, the ILO's mandate on achieving equality in the world of work highlights the importance of reducing the gap between the rich and the poor and the need for gender parity. As we celebrate International Women's Day, it will be remiss of me not to note the transformation of our Caribbean societies from peaceful, friendly, welcoming nations to societies plagued by violence, fear, and grief, and societies where there continue to be rampant crime and injustice against our women, our boys, and our girls. Within recent times, in Trinidad and Tobago, we could not help but to recoil in horror as we learn of the violent and pernicious nature of the murders of our women. Moreover, the daily stresses associated with the COVID-19 pandemic has added an extra layer of uncertainty, insecurities, and fear in the lives of citizens. Crisis and frontline workers face additional stress, so too are domestic workers, persons who own businesses, who have to consider whether their business will survive the pandemic, and several workers who worry about an uncertain future. All these stresses can lead to more violence at home and violence and harassment in the workplace. To add to this, there's the violence and harassment in the workplace in the Caribbean is so pervasive and continues to exist for the most part due to the unequal power and the power play dynamics in the workplace between employers and workers, and undermines gender equality. I dare say the economic, social, and cultural personal insecurity which citizens now experience in their daily lives, particularly in this pandemic, can feed directly into perpetuating insecure and less resilient countries. Where this type of insecurity proliferates communities and nations, in my view, the struggle to realize their full potential and to contribute meaningfully to the achievement of parity is affected, and the achievement of equality and justice for all. Jeanette Ascona, the lead author in UN's Women latest report, stated, and I quote, "For the last 22 years, extreme poverty globally has been declining. Then came COVID-19, and with it, massive job losses, shrinking of economies, and loss of livelihoods, particularly for women. Weakened social protection systems have left most of the poorest society unprotected without any safeguards to weather the storm," unquote. The ratification of Convention 109 is indeed a step in the right direction to achieve dignity and safety in the world of work. I leave you with the timeless advice of Dr. Martin Luther King, who in his seminal treatise on the moral imperative to do the right thing, the letter from Birmingham jail, which some of you would know, when he said, "Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly," unquote. COVID-19 and its widespread impact have made this mutuality an inescapable reality. But it is also scary and a sad fact, that Calypsonian's Crunter advice from 1981 about travel for women in Trinidad, which is to take the number, is still a reality for women 40 years later. Let us seize the opportunity to individually recommit ourselves that it will not take another 40 years for this to cease to exist. Happy International Women's Day to all of you, and I wish you all a very good day.
Thank you very much, Madam President. You have laid a strong foundation for today's discussion on Convention 190 by explaining to us the structure of 190, its range, its scope and context, and you have also directed us to the need to confront our realities, guided us also, guidance especially relevant for us in small island states and how we can effectively implement the provisions of C190. Thank you again. Our next presenter this morning is Sandra Messiah. Sandra is a Public Services International's representative for the Caribbean, working with PSI's 22 affiliates in 20 countries and territories in the English, French, and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. Sandra is Barbadian by birth, but is perhaps better described and is certainly well known as a Caribbean person, a Caribbean trade unionist. She started her trade union career when she worked in the public service of Barbados, first as a shop steward and activist of the National Union of Public Workers, serving as a chair of the union's youth league. She later on served on the union's executive as public relations officer. Prior to her current position with Public Services International, Sandra worked as a project coordinator for the Commonwealth Trade Union Council. She is an alumna of the Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conference and continues to serve as a member of the Barbados Steering Committee for the Duke of Edinburgh's Emerging Leaders Dialogue. She is currently representing PSI on the Gender Equity Hub, a thematic hub in the Global Health Workforce Network that is co-chaired by Women in Global Health and the World Health Organization. Sandra's interests are wide and varied, and she always works to ensure that there is a Caribbean small island developing states perspective in global issues and themes. She is an economist by training and continues to use that training as well as the skills and knowledge in journalism, information and communications technology, and communications with trade unionists, members of civil society, as well as multilateral agencies throughout the world. Mrs. Massiah, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta, and thanks to the Cipriani College of Labour and Cooperative Studies, as well as my colleagues in Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed across the Caribbean. I'm finding it particularly interesting that we're all together, not only in terms of dealing with an issue that is quite pervasive in our various societies, but that I think for this time, this period of time within our existence and within our various stages of development, they're all speaking with one voice. And that we actually now have a tool that we can use. In fact, two tools, not only the convention, but also the recommendation to help guide us in not only dealing with, but actually preventing violence and harassment in the world of work. Just a little bit about Public Services International. We're a global union federation. We're right across the world, over 700 trade unions, where we represent over 30 million workers who deliver the valuable public services that you, in some ways, are now even more realizing the need and the value of those public services. We work with and we bring the voices of public services workers to the United Nations, to the ILO, to the World Health Organization, particularly important at this time. And then we also work with other regional and global organizations. In summary, we defend the trade union and workers' rights of all citizens, all workers, and particularly of public services workers. And of course, we're fighting for universal access to quality public services. My discussion with you this morning is going to be, I think, grounded in four main areas. And want to look at the leadership role that's been played by women trade unionists in terms of C-190 and the accompanying recommendation 206. I also want to put some focus on the fact that these two instruments establish a new right. That is a right to work, a work environment or a world of work that is free from violence and harassment. Thirdly, I want to look at the ways in which C-190 and R-206 are important in designing and implementing responses to COVID-19, as well as dealing with a recovery in a COVID era. And fourthly, I also want to look at particularly the role of the tripartite partners in ensuring the new right, as well as the ways in which they will use the supervisory mechanism to examine how standards are applied in the various member states, and that they constantly seek to improve that application. If we remain on this slide and we go one by one, I'd like to point out some important facts. The trade union movement has played the pivotal role in ensuring that there is a C-190 and R-206. Way back from in 2004, 2005, many trade union women, joined by trade union men across the world, worked assiduously to ensure that the discussion towards having a convention accompanied by a recommendation reached the floor of the International Labour Conference. In fact, it was through the hard work of many of the global union federations, and I know that many of you who are listening would have been involved in awareness raising during those many 15 years to reach where we are now, where 190 and 206 have been adopted by the International Labour Conference. I'd like to also talk further about the leadership in terms of the 4 ratifications that we have thus far. It is through the work of the trade union women in each of those 4 countries, not only in terms of ensuring that their countries adopted the convention, but also that they put the necessary measures in place towards the ratification. But then it doesn't stop there. Ratification isn't all that there is. Women, trade unionists in particular, across the world, are actually working very hard to ensure the ratification. And if we focus particularly on the Caribbean, we're taking up that work by focusing particularly, in the case of PSI, on 2 of our countries in which we have affiliates. We're building it on the basis of the fact that the governments of those 2 countries, Barbados and Jamaica, made public commitments to ratify the convention C-190. We want to ensure that when the convention is ratified, and we're ensuring as well that COVID-19 is not seen as a reason for delaying the ratification exercises, we want to make sure that not only are there awareness raising activities in the various countries, but that people recognize that it's also in the implementation, it's in developing the skills and talents, not only of our trade unionists, but indeed of everyone in society, to ensure that this forward-looking, integrated, and inclusive convention actually makes the difference in not only dealing with remedies for commitment for those who commit situations of violence and harassment, but also that we're forward-looking in terms of preventing violence and harassment in all areas of the world of work. It's part of what we're talking about when we talk about the transformative change that needs to be made. So it's not simply just talking about building the awareness, we have to move towards transforming our societies. And in the Caribbean, we also want to make sure that the governments, all governments, do not use the situations of COVID-19 to delay the ratification process and all the attendant steps that they have to make. In fact, C-190 and the recommendations contained in 206 are very much needed now more than ever. The second area that I want to focus on is the fact that we now have a new human right, a right to work in an environment that is free from violence and harassment. And it means as well the whole matter of gender-based violence and harassment in all its various forms, noting especially that the convention applies to everyone in both public and private spheres. We're talking not only of those who are currently in work, it involves even workers who were terminated. It involves job seekers and applicants. It involves managers. It involves line staff. It involves volunteers. And there are many, many volunteers being called upon as we seek now to battle COVID-19. It is both in the formal and informal economy, and whether the work environment is either urban or rural. I've been talking quite a bit about COVID-19, or referring a lot to COVID-19, and I'd like to bring to the attention of all, or to reinforce, that this is the year of the health and care worker. The theme is to protect, invest, and that we have to work together. And I mean really work together. It is not just a simple matter of talking about the importance of having COVID-19 being looked at now that it is before us, but to recognize that we are in a COVID era. This will not be the last pandemic. It will not be the last crisis that we have to deal with. And it is in times of crisis that instances and cases of violence and harassment appear even more. The economic crisis itself is increasing the risk of violence and harassment, and accompanying with it is the use of that economic crisis to actually put cases of violence and harassment in the realm of workers, those who are looking for jobs, and unfortunately it is predominantly women who are affected by this. We also need to ensure that there's safe and easy access to justice, and that there must be remedies for victims and survivors of violence and harassment. In this right, we're talking particularly about those workers who are on the front lines. And in many cases, those are the workers who are at the lowest paid. Many of us refer to those categories of workers as workers in the 5 C's. That is in terms of the clerical, cashiering, catering, I'm sorry, I've missed myself here in my notes. And we need to ensure that in dealing with those workers, we are not only talking about protecting them from the violence and harassment that may be seen as physical or mental, but we're also talking about protecting them from the economic violence that they will be and are being subjected to in their various spheres of work. The third area that I wanted to look at was not only in terms of looking the responses in terms of COVID-19, but particularly in terms of the recovery efforts that we have to make. There's a lot of talk about the care economy, and in fact, PSI is working to actually change that discourse. We want to really be recognizing and guaranteeing that there's a human right to care, and that we must really work very hard, and we're actually developing various arguments and advocacy to remove care from an economic and market sphere and put it at the center of politics and human rights. It means that we have to be focusing on rebuilding the social organization of care. We're talking here about the 5 R's, recognizing the social and economic value of care work, whether it be paid and unpaid or unpaid. We need to reward and remunerate with equal pay for work of equal value, pensions, working conditions, and social protection. We need to reduce the burden of unpaid care work on women. We need to redistribute that care work among all family members and workers, where we change the sexual division of labor. And of course, we need to reclaim the primary duty and responsibility of the state to provide public care services and develop care systems that transform gender relations. And my 4th point relates to the role of the tripartite partners. As leaders in our own right within the trade union movement, we started developing tools in which not only to deal with, but to work towards the elimination of violence and harassment. Now it is unions themselves that must take steps to ensure that their own organization and operation are free from violence and harassment. And that must be done in line with C190 and the recommendations in 206. For example, carrying out risk assessments, carrying out workplace policies, making sure that those policies apply equally to trade union organization. There must be training, there must be information, and of course, continued awareness raising. And that kind of work is not only in terms of ratifying the C190, but it's also in terms of the implementation of the convention. And let me quickly add here that one instance in the case of Namibia, they actually ratified C190 as well as C189, which deals with domestic workers. And therein it is important to recognize as well that the 2 conventions work in tandem, they work with each other. But of course, this is a matter that will require a lot more discussion, and I hope that there will be an opportunity to discuss this at a future webinar. Now in the Caribbean, also to note about C189 is that we've got Guyana, Jamaica, and Grenada in that order that have ratified C189. And even more important, I believe, for us in the trade union movement, and certainly for us within PSI, is the importance of using the ILO supervisory mechanism. That mechanism is set up not only to examine how the standards are applied in the various member states, but also to constantly seek to improve the application of those standards. It is to ensure that through social dialogue and technical assistance, the conventions that have been ratified are put into practice. And it also provides an opportunity for the recommendations, though not binding, to be incorporated in collective agreements and in workplace policy. I spoke a little earlier about the importance of looking at care work. And if we move to the next slide, I'd like to share with you the quote from our General Secretary, Rosa Parvanelli. And in fact, this is one of the planks of our action and our imperatives for International Women's Day this year, and our various advocacy actions also at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And permit me to read. It is essential to change the course and discourse on gender inequality and violence, to change the logic of care towards that of a public good through the recognition and guarantee of the human right to care, removing care from the economic and market sphere and placing it at the center of politics, in other words, of human rights. And we believe that as we continue the discussions, particularly as we look at the matter of the recovery in a COVID era, I'm not sure when will be post-COVID, so I prefer to talk about in a COVID era, that we make sure that we do not take this whole matter of care and continually talk only about a care economy, but recognize that there's an important right to care. And as I wrap up, as we move as well to the last slide, I'd like to talk about this road to recovery in a COVID era. And what I'd like to focus on in terms of the imperatives, I would dare say yes for the Caribbean, but in fact they apply to the world on the whole. We need to ensure that we have gender responsive quality public services. That is the public services that respond to the needs of men and women. We're talking about transforming our societies, our economies. Therefore, gender transformative approaches are important. They're critical. We must have decent jobs. And in this situation where we're talking about ensuring that we need and we have more jobs in order to fuel our economies, not only must those jobs be decent jobs, but it is the view of Public Services International that there are actually many opportunities for quality public service jobs, and particularly in health, in care, in social services, and in education. We also must recognize and guarantee the human right to care. We cannot overemphasize that as an imperative for us in the Caribbean. And of course, we must have renewed approaches to collective bargaining, social dialogue, and social partnership that involve things like talking about equal pay for work of equal value, pay equity, gender neutral job evaluation systems that will address the structural challenges we have in terms of how pay is determined, and in many cases the things that are done almost unconsciously but are part of our system. We need, obviously, the experiences across the Caribbean, indeed across the world, have shown that we need renewed and enhanced social protection measures. And to reiterate what is often said by the ILO and others within the social protection field, social protection is not only for the poor. And those social protection measures must also be gender responsive and gender transformative. And of course, we must have a reconciliation of work and family life. Sisters, brothers, colleagues, friends, it's important as we look at what our lives are, the challenges, mental, physical, psychological, that we face in this COVID era, that we view the move to transform, the move to get people back out to work, not only from a point of view of starting an economy full stop, but ensuring that we respect rights, we enhance the rights, and that we also take conventions, and particularly a pivotal convention, a transformative and inclusive convention such as C190, and the provisions contained in the accompanying recommendation, not only to heart, but that we work very hard to include them in the policies, programs, and actions that we undertake if we truly want to transform our economies, and if we truly are talking about resilience and sustainable development. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you very much, Sandra. You have reminded us of the leadership role played by both women trade unionists and male activists in the adoption of the convention and its accompanying recommendation. And what you've also done, quite importantly, is directed us to the importance of the convention and recommendation for designing responses to violence and harassment across all workplaces and workspaces, and in responding to the changes and challenges wrought on our societies by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I introduce the next presenter, I just want to acknowledge the questions that we have received thus far and encourage everyone to Please continue asking your questions. We will deal and address with all at the end of the presentations. At this time, I'd like to introduce our third presenter, Mr. Ian Daniel. Mr. Daniel is the head of the Labor Studies Department of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. He has been a member of the faculty since 1999 and is often described by the director of the college, Dr. Henry, as the conscience of the institution. He has lectured in industrial relations, politics, labor history, sociology, and psychology. He is also involved in the design and facilitation of specialized and customized training interventions in industrial relations practice. He is also a two-time appointee to the Registration, Recognition, and Certification Board of Trinidad and Tobago as an independent member alternate. Mr. Daniel has worked in education, banking, retail sales, and services. He has been a consultant, writer, researcher, local community organizer, mass designer, artist, and poet. His current research interest lies in the area of identity and social change. Mr. Daniel, the virtual floor is now yours.
Good morning, and thank you, ma'am, for that kind introduction. I'm happy to be here today in celebration of International Women's Day, which means that I'm a little bit odd on the panel, but nonetheless, it's something that I am happy to participate in. I want to use this occasion as the opportunity to look at some of the intractable, excuse me as we try to get the presentation up here, some of the intractable problems in our society, the problems of disadvantage and marginalization. My presentation as such is a less ambitious effort, and it will look at conventions and international standards more as methodology for social change rather than focusing on C190 itself. And so the issue here is that problems are difficult, social problems are difficult, and if we take the focus of C190 as the opportunity, we are looking at violence, and I think that the difficulty of it is captured in this first picture, where some people may actually not be able to identify when they are aggressing on someone else. And so the question is, like, do we even know violence when we see it? We have some very popular pictures out of the international media there. You probably recognize Eric Garner and George Floyd. And what is interesting here is that some people don't agree that these are pictures of violence. Some people might actually say these are justifiable uses of force. What about in our own local example, one shot, one kill, and the war on monsters and cockroaches? I mean, that obviously is much more acceptable, except that I have the real impression that 99 out of 100 times when one says monster and cockroach, it's someone who looks like me. So when I'm thinking about violence, I'm asking myself, is violence universal? You know, can we solve an issue of violence? And forgive me, but I'm not going to make a distinction between violence and harassment. I'm just going to use the term violence. Can we solve the problem of violence without knowing where it came from, where its antecedents? Can we solve the problem of violence without understanding the culture of power and the way that the practices of power have become part and parcel of our practices of being? Is it possible for us to understand violence without understanding our history of colonialism and capitalism, without recognizing that the very societies within which we live were built on violence, were built deliberately on violence? The gears and levers of our society are violent. And as Frantz Fanon would say, a society is not racist, it's not violent by mistake, it's deliberately so. And so if you start from that perspective, then what's the legacy? What's the legacy of this history that we have to deal with today? And you look at hard questions about our sense of being. I mean, I can't answer all of these questions, but they're there to be asked. Is our culture a culture of virtue or lewdness and misogyny? Is race and ethnicity something that we celebrate, or our enrichment of our society, or is it about control? Is it about domination and separation? Look at the economic theory that we practice, the theory of trickle down and neglect. We use borrowed terms to refer to ourselves, millennial, Gen Z. We prefer to use the Dutch disease rather than the much more eloquent plantation society thesis. It's almost as if we are either forced to accept that we are less than, and at the same time to say that if we have to have value, we must accept that which is imposed externally. How do we know ourselves out of this? Am I black, brown, red, fair, high color? Do I have good hair or bad hair? Am I a Dan or a serial abuser and family abandoner? How do we come to terms with violence when all too often violence is something that we may not even be aware of, that can be around us, steeped into our practices of existence, that we may not even become aware of when it touches us or how it touches us? How do we then treat with violence and avoid getting stuck in these difficult histories of domination, these difficult histories of exclusion? And I think that, for me, that's where the standards and international conventions become important, because they offer a platform for action. They benefit from elevation, from perspective, from distance, by adopting cross-cultural analysis, by looking at whatever the problem, in this case violence, from a cross-cultural context. They look at effective practice in different settings. They set up a context not for a cookie-cutter application of a solution, but for a context-specific adaptation. In this particular convention, there's a clear subtext about gender-based violence and violence against women, and so as you listen to her Honor's elaboration on C-190, you saw exactly what was happening. We had a clear definition of the problem. We had identified available resources that can be applied to the solution of the problem. The opportunity and location work as a location at which the problem could be attacked. And very importantly, a focus on the most vulnerable of our society, the groups that are being affected most in our society. And this is important. This is an important kind of methodological perspective, because what it demonstrates is the recognition that problems are interrelated in society. There's a degree of intersectionality in our problems. And I think that that's a point that the second presenter raised as well, Sandra Messiah. So when you start attacking an issue in the context of work, the effects don't remain in work. the effects ripple out and go into other areas. Affecting work affects family. Affecting work affects society. Affecting work affects economy. And the interesting thing about the conventions and standards as you go through them is that they almost make visible these interconnections, the interconnections along which practical solutions will run, the interconnections that show you where add-on problems will exist and where more resources should be applied. So the conventions and international standards actually lay a framework for a material impact on the problems, for stakeholders to see what's in the problem and what's in the solution for them. But it also enables introspection. It also enables confrontation of the histories of abuse. It also enables the confrontation of exploitation and social dysfunction. And this becomes important because what we are trying to do, as the second presenter pointed out, is that we are trying to engage in social change. We are trying to engage in social transformation. And going back to the reference to our history of violence, we must recognize that you cannot change a thing that was made to be violent. You cannot reform a thing that was made to be violent when it works in the way that it was made to do. You can't reach in and just take hold of its parts and suddenly make it different. Transformation is what is required, but transformation requires critical mass. Transformation requires that people understand and recognize what's going on. And so one of the most important areas that conventions and international standards attack is that need for social introspection, that need for education, that need for outreach that surrounds practical action, that supports practical action, because it is only consciousness that can support this level of transformation. I wish that what's in it for me would be enough, but very often it isn't. Consciousness supports action, which supports consciousness. And so the idea here is that education leads to empowerment, to negotiation, regulation, and hopefully to some kind of sustained growth, to some kind of resilience that is necessary for us to respond to something like a pandemic. You know, International Women's Day is I think, a perfect opportunity for us to sit and think about issues like this. Despite COVID, despite unending recessions, despite all of these unending, intractable social problems, we continue to make opportunities to attack these big, complex social problems. Is the methodology that C190 and other conventions offer perfect? Maybe not. Is it too transactional? You know, why is it not more based on mutual recognition of the problems? I don't know. But I think that at the end of the day, we always have to balance the need for material change, real practical material change, with the recognition of the legitimacy of problems that particular groups face, with some ability to get those who benefit from the problems in society to recognize a need to change. these conventions, these international standards, they are vitally important to me. They are the opportunity to face up to our cultures of exploitation, to our toxic materialism, and to our systems of abuse. Thank you very much. Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you very much, Ian, for providing perspectives on why we need to discuss behavior change and where we can start the much needed conversation on behavior change and the transformation of our societies, which will support our movement towards suitable, sustainable, which is very important, sustainable, and thereby effective implementation of Convention 190 within our societies. At this point, we would move to the questions segment of this morning's proceedings. Our first question is a question regarding the ratification of ILO Convention 190 by Trinidad and Tobago. So I think we can all agree I'm well posed to respond to that question. Just to give a little bit of a background, all International Labour Organization members are required to submit instruments which have been adopted by the International Labour Conference to its competent authorities within 1 year of the instrument being adopted. For Trinidad and Tobago and most of the region, that would be the parliament of your respective country. Accordingly, in Trinidad and Tobago, the instruments were submitted to the House of Representatives on Friday, March 13, 2020, and to the Senate on Tuesday, 17th of March, 2020. Both Conventions 190 and 206 were reviewed by the ILO 144 Tripartite Consultative Committee, and recommendations of the committee have been submitted to the Minister of Labour and are under consideration by the Ministry of Labour to ensure that we effectively and sustainably implement its provisions. So at this time, we are not at the point of having ratified the convention, but we are moving steadfastly and seriously towards that goal. Question number 2 is a question that comes from Mr. Michael Anisette. Mr. Michael Anisette asks, what is required to mobilize our region to ensure all governments ratify Convention 190? So this is a question I think it might be good to hear the perspective of all members on the panel. So I would like to start with Her Honor, Mrs. Deborah Thomas Felix, in terms of what your perspectives would be in responding to this question.
I think one of the first things that have to be considered when there is ratification of any convention is political will. And I think NGOs, civil society, the trade union movement, etc., would be like the force, the driving force behind galvanizing governments throughout the region to ratify. So the mobilization is not only, in my view, from trade union movements, but also from civil society. But in terms of ratifying the convention, that has to do with political will. It is important to note that even if the convention is ratified, because of the type of system we have in the Caribbean, the convention has to be reduced into law, into legislation. In some countries, the ratification of the convention makes the convention automatic and becomes law immediately. In the Caribbean, in the Commonwealth Caribbean, the ratification of the convention is just a stepping stone. What has to be done is for the convention to be reduced into legislation, and that the parliaments throughout the Caribbean pass the convention, pass the legislation, which will give effect to the convention.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I now invite Ms. Massiah and then followed by Mr. Daniel to provide your perspectives on this question.
Great. Actually, a rather interesting question because it lays bare, I think, the intricacies of the role of the trade union movement, and I'm going to take that angle in my responses. First of all, obviously there's a matter of awareness raising. Some of that has been done already, but I think it has to go deeper. Secondly, the awareness raising has to be not only amongst the members of the unions, the respective unions, but also together with other members of civil society. And I think that this is where sometimes we need to look at ourselves and determine, are we doing enough to join together and in some ways influence some of the other NGOs and civil society organizations in terms of seeing the broad range of actions that can be taken and coalescing the various voices. I think the third thing is to help ensure that where there are consultations, and governments have been calling some meetings, the 144 committees, and other various forms of consultation, that the trade union movement must attend, but not only attend, but attend with very clear perspectives and clear objectives in mind, and having some very strong positions that they continue to speak on and that they reverberate not only in those meetings, but indeed through all of areas in which the trade union movement would be interacting. And I think fourth is the fact of the recommendations. You do not have to wait until the convention has been ratified to put policies in place, start the ball rolling in terms of putting this on the bargaining agenda with your various employers in the case of those within the private sector, and even those within the public services sector can actually start including it on their bargaining agendas. And that, of course, includes, and I want to emphasize this, the trade union movement itself. The first group of people I would strongly suggest who should ensure that they have workplace policies that take into consideration and reflect the provisions of C-190 and R-206 are the various trade unions. Within PSI, we've been looking at our current policies, looking at ways in which we need to revamp them, and ensuring that we are leading by example. So I think that that's the message I would lead the trade union movement in ensuring or working towards the ratification has to lead by example.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Mr. Daniel?
Well, you keep asking me to come in after Ms. Massiah said everything that needs to be said. I think that just to generalize a little bit more from what she's saying, what is necessary is engagement, unrelenting engagement. We have to discuss these issues in every forum, in every space that becomes available. So in addition to the trade unions doing what they must do, we have to have settings like this go on discussing these issues, and that becomes important because for so many of us, we have people who are working in non-unionized environments. So the question is, if we become overly dependent on unions in their existing form, then how does it move forward? So it's got to go beyond to a greater community of involvement, a greater community of education and mobilization, and start to join communities together to make things like this become par for the course.
Thank you very much, Ian. And in response to provide guidance with respect to Sandra's suggestion or recommendations for policy development, I'm very happy to say that the Ministry of Labour has developed a national workplace policy on sexual harassment, and it can be accessed at the Ministry of Labour's website, labour.gov.tt, and the staff of the Conciliation, Advisory and Advocacy Division of the Ministry are available to provide guidance and assistance in implementing this policy in your workplaces. And I know that it is a policy designed for Trinidad and Tobago, but I am certain that across the region there could be guidance or use and value in looking to this policy. So just a reminder of the ministry's website, labour.gov.tt, and you're going under the resources tab to the right hand side of the page, and you will find all of the ministry's policies there to access and utilize. The other question that we have, and Ian, to be fair to you, I will give you the first stab at this question. How do we address the cultural, political, and social landscape that requires personal and collective ownership for the transformational changes that is required for us to respect and dignify women? Again, from Mr. Amisens.
Thank you. I think you need to repeat that question there for me. I was a bit of a mouthful.
So let's. So first of all, maybe we can take it in pieces.
Please.
What do you think is required for us to respect and dignify women? Today's forum is being held against the context of International Women's Day. So what do we need to dignify and to do to respect and dignify women in our societies?
That is a difficult one for me. You know, I will give it to you from my own personal and historical perspective. I have lived in families that were led by strong, positive female figures. I have had examples of less than positive masculine roles. It is such a complex issue. It is such a complex issue, but I struggle with it all over because it's almost easy to say, well, look, you know what, men have to respect. But then I look at something like the example I was using while coming up preparing for this was the soca song "Is a Snack Pack," you know, and I'm wondering, is that empowerment or is that objectification? You know, there are just so many pitfalls, so many points at which not just men but women and society as a whole need to engage with the ideas of what is self, what is gender, what is respect, what is empowerment, what is discrimination, and the need to end discrimination. I wish there was an easy answer to give to you. All I can say is that for me, it has become a continuous program of self-reflection, of self-analysis, and of trying to weed out for myself every practice that I can become aware of that denies that respect, that denies that honor to women. Which includes, you know, do I do enough to take care of my wife when I go home, or do I expect her to take care of me? I think, unfortunately, I feel in that too often. You know, it includes, you know, the analogy. Am I a man because of the number of women that I have had sexual relationships with, the number of children that I have outside there? Is that the measurement of a man? This is such a huge problem, and the only answer that I've come up with is the pursuit of self reflection and self-improvement.
Thank you, yeah. I know, coming from a household where my parents raised 4 daughters and 1 son, we were never in a situation where we felt as females that we were lesser. And that was not just something driven by the strong woman in my family, but it was also driven by my father. My father was insistent that his daughters must have the access to the same opportunities that his son would have. So for me, that is something that is also important in the home. The men in the home recognizing that we need to respect and dignify not just the women, but our girls and our children, and teach each other to do so. Madam President, would you like to provide us with a perspective in terms of the importance of collective ownership for changing our societies, especially in light of your seat on the Committee of Experts on the application and ratification of conventions and recommendations?
Actually, when I heard the question, I thought it is a thesis because it requires a very deep, in-depth response, and it is not something that could be superficial. So I will take the cultural part of it to say that in the Caribbean, there is, we know that culturally how we are. There are these remarks, there are innuendos, there's touching, there is all of that which we say is part of our culture. And I'm relating it to the legislation when it comes into place. I am one person who is of the view that cultural mores and norms must be taken into consideration, and there must be a section, and I'm speaking now as a lawyer, an interpretation section which is not exhaustive, with certain types of behavior which we consider to be the norm and to be part of our culture, but which by themselves is harassing conduct or in conduct of violence, conduct of abuse, but it is so entrenched in our culture. Some may say, oh, he's just giving you a hug. So it might be when we are looking for legislation in the Caribbean with respect to this convention, that we have a very elaborate definition section to point out to the reader what is considered sexual harassment, what is considered violence, what is considered harassment on the whole, which might be part of the cultural underpinning of that particular country in the Caribbean. Now, like I said, the entire question is like a thesis. On the political front, there is, and the men in the room will have to forgive me for saying this, in the Caribbean, our experience of women who are leaders are very few. And therefore, the issues which affect women may not necessarily be on the front burner. As like I said in my speech, like fixing a road and putting up a big stadium. It may be politically that the question of the politicians treating harassment and violence as a very pressing and a very debilitating issue in the workplace, and they use their political platform to create the legislation and to create a healthier space and a healthier environment for people to work. So that is as broad as I can hit the political part. On the social level, I think we all are each other's keeper. There is a proliferation of violence, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago. And from when I sat as a magistrate many years ago, the type of violence which, and that's many years ago, I became a magistrate in 1990. The type of violence and the type of incidents of violence we had then, it's really amplified in 2021. And the pernicious and vicious nature of this violence And I'm talking about violence generally in society. So apart from the politicians doing their part to create a proper platform and proper legislation for society to feel comfortable, society as a whole has to be each other's keeper. And that's why I'm saying it will be a thesis, because if I begin to speak about society's role, I can speak until tomorrow morning. But it cannot be that there is an outrage when you think that the type of violence is very vicious and there is silence with other violence. Violence is violence. Murder is murder. And none of it, in my view, should be tolerated and should be sanctioned. So the question is, I am of the view that we have sufficient laws in Trinidad and Tobago, I don't know about the rest of the Caribbean, to address violence. We do have the laws. Part of it might be enforcement, and when I say enforcement, I'm not speaking law enforcement. It is for each of us in the society to take a position to say, enough is enough. And when we think about violence against women and the type of murders we've had from December to now against our young women, how much can a society take of that? How much grief can we fathom for one society? How many mothers, sisters, brothers, auntie, uncle, and the like are grieving because of the losses they have experienced by violence? And let's put it in a small area over the last 5 years. And I think when you look at it in that context, you will be able to shape policies and to determine what is acceptable. Because if it is not acceptable that I am in the workplace and my employer is making unwanted advances at me, and I have to accept it because there is no law to protect me, then when you translate that to the wider setting of violence, what is really the difference? So I think I need to rest because I can write a whole thing down. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Your passion came through clear and loud without you even having to raise your voice. Thank you so much for that. Ms. Massiah, Sandra, one part of the question that I would like to have your perspective on as a trade unionist who operates not just on a national level, but a national level and provides leadership. What do you see as being the role of trade unions in addressing the cultural, political, and social landscape that we need to address in order to effect change in respect of this topic, violence and harassment in the workplace?
Yeah, I think that kind of hinges to what Ian was saying a little earlier, and in fact, in terms of his own presentation. The trade union movement, and permit me if I do get into being a bit blunt, in the Caribbean we have to be very introspective about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and with whom we're doing it. We have to actually be part of the society, and sometimes it comes across to me as though we only talk about our members. And if we want to be interacting with and actually making the case that the things we do within the movement impact society, as we know it does, I mean from the very beginning, it means that we have to reestablish the connection with society. Whether those people within society are members, potential members, people who probably never even thought about it, we have to make that connection. And I think that that's the particular role we have to engage in terms of making the transformative change. We ourselves have to do some, not only in terms of the introspection, but also some transformation in terms of how we really interact, and are we really the voices of the people and not only the voices of workers? Because workers have families, workers have friends, workers have colleagues, and they are going to be talking about and living the things that they're experiencing. So I think it goes back to the root of who we are and what we do within the trade union movement. Are we really connecting with and speaking on behalf of workers and their families? Are we only talking about our members and then becoming there's some who tell us that we're just a special interest group? Are we really making the connections? Are we seeing the rights-based approach? Are we using the rights-based approach in the way in which we deal with various issues in society? For example, if we migrants, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, and your own issues there, how are we seeing this convention, C190, and how will we be using it as trade unionists, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the Caribbean, and with the support of our international colleagues in terms of making the necessary changes. In short, I think we need to reconnect with society. We need to be able to explain even more so to our young people in society about what we do, why we do it, and how we do it, and to connect with them in more meaningful ways, that we're talking about the issues that matter to them, and to show the ways in which working together in collective efforts and through collective bargaining, that we can make the positive difference in people's lives. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Ian, the next question is yours, since you were so eager to go first. But I think you're well poised to help us with this one. Could any panelist advise on the history of ratification of ILO conventions and making same law? So, from your perspective, having had the varied experiences you have, how do you see ratification of ILO conventions and their linkage to lawmaking within the region?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me when you say how do I see it. I mean, is it important? Is it something that's desirable? Do I think that
well, let's start off on your perspective. As do you think it is desirable for us to go down that road?
I think it is desirable. I think that we need any opportunity to engage in open, honest, informed discussion on the problems that we face in our society. I think that is one of the shortcomings of our societies, of our region, maybe more in recent time than previously. But I think that we have gone through almost a dark ages period of discussing some of these big, weighty discussions. I remember when I was growing up, some of the most important social issue discussions in the world were led by Caribbean thinkers, and Caribbean thinkers with a working class background. And those voices don't seem to be there as often as I'm accustomed, or I became accustomed. So I think that conventions like this one become an important opportunity for us to do exactly what Mr. Massiah was just saying, engaging in these heavy discussions, and not just engaging in them with our small memberships, but engaging in them with all of the connected communities that are and will be affected by these issues. If we don't do that, then what we will have people coming into stakeholder groups who do not see themselves connected to the goals, do not see themselves affected by the problems, and may not see themselves as necessarily part of the solution. So anything that gives me the opportunity to go into, to dissect these problems and to come up with solutions that can result in change, that's a process that we just have to be a part of.
Thank you. Madam President, I do have a specific question directed, and I was pointed that I must ask you this question, but I was wondering before I go into that, if you can give your perspective on the ratification of conventions and lawmaking within the Caribbean. Is it that you think we have a good record, we have room for improvement? What are your thoughts?
I wouldn't comment on that. What I will comment and say is that the ratification process of a convention takes place after two countries. If two countries ratify a convention, 1 year after the first ratification, it comes into force. So, for example, Uruguay ratified Convention 190 in June last year, which was, I think it's the 25th of June last year. And then came Namibia, then came Argentina and Fiji. What happens is that the convention now comes into force in June this year. So it's 1 year after two countries have ratified it. Coming into force means that the convention now becomes a convention, and therefore countries can use it as law. But more importantly, the convention also becomes an international labor standard. As to the ratification of conventions in the Caribbean, I think I don't want to comment on that, because each country will determine what conventions are very important for it, and they decide how many conventions are ratified. I think Trinidad and Tobago has ratified, I think, 21 conventions. 2 of them are no longer in existence, so I think Trinidad and Tobago probably has 19 conventions which it has ratified. The question of if we were to go to the existing convention, which we are talking about, it is very heartening to know that Trinidad and Tobago is in the process of deliberating on that convention with a view to ratifying it. I know that throughout the Caribbean, there's a question of the Domestic Workers Convention, which most people believe that the Americas, including the Caribbean, should ratify, because in the Americas, particularly Latin America, there are a number of domestic workers. That convention, 30 countries, states, ILO states have ratified it, and out of those states, 11 of them are from the Americas. So each country has to determine what its needs are and whether they should recommend or not.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for reminding us that it's not a one-size-fits-all operation. When we ratify a convention and we make a law, we actually have to look at what our society needs in order to give effective implementation to that convention. The specific question I got for you, Madam President, is that in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the Maternity Protection Act, yet some women still complain about difficulties when dealing with their employers in the cases of pregnancies. With the existence of this Protection Act, why are these women still facing problems with their employers? Can you offer any perspectives on this issue for us, Madam President?
Thank you. I think that is a very important question. We have laws, of course, we have the Maternity Protection Act. Part of it has to do with education. Employers do not understand that when someone is on maternity leave and they bring someone to fill that position, that person who comes on board is there as a temporary employee. In fact, the Act says categorically that you cannot demote the person when she's on maternity leave. You cannot dismiss her when she's on maternity leave. What you could do is to promote her or keep her in the position she was in before. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the Act. It might be because of education and the Act, but some employers, we've had a number of cases in the court, and what some employers do is that they refuse to even fill out the forms for the women to go to national insurance to get that additional income and stipend which they are entitled to. That creates a lot of problems, and we have a lot of matters in courts for that. I cannot say what will cause any normal thinking person to behave in that way. In my view, that has nothing to do with education. But the dynamics with respect to pregnant women in the workplace is very, very troubling. And although Trinidad and Tobago has an act, we have a number of domestic maternity protection matters before the court. It might be that organizations like the ECA, etc., may have to do training programs, but a lot of the employers are of the view that if the person is not there for 3 months, they can fill the position and not make a temporary hire in the position, which is absolutely contrary to the law.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are running a little over time, but I'd just like to address the last 2 questions that we've gotten. One question asked, if Convention 190 is ratified, are there any laws that are enforceable that can be used to protect women against violence in the workplace? And also, whether the common law can provide any assistance in respecting violence and harassment in the workplace. Within Trinidad and Tobago, we do have legislative avenues currently to address violence and harassment in the workplace. We have, under the Industrial Relations Act, provision is made for disputes to be brought when, in respect of sexual harassment, they are and have been reported as constructive dismissal or termination of services. So the Conciliation, Advisory and Advocacy Unit of the Ministry of Labour can address those complaints under that heading. The Industrial Court since 1995, so this is a merger of the two, a response to the 2 questions. Since 1995, the Industrial Court has been addressing issues related to sexual harassment in the workplace, starting with the Bank Employees Union and Republic Bank Limited decision and continuing from there. In addition, you have, moving back to legislation, you also have the Children's Authority being able to address issues relating to the protection of children and for matters where the victim is a child, as outlined within the Children's Act. You can also report an offense under the Sexual Offences Act. Sexual offences are criminal offences, and perpetrators are liable to conviction in the criminal court. Also, the Occupational Safety and Health Act provides for keeping a workplace, an employer providing an employee with a safe and healthy workplace, which can include and extend to violence and harassment in the workplace, and the employer taking steps to address those cases there. A complaint for discrimination in relation to discriminatory employment practices can also be filed against the employer in terms of sexual harassment, because we see that sometimes it's a power struggle that is happening in that instance. Can also be filed at the Equal Opportunity Commission. And now these, you can also utilize social dialogue. These are all laid out. It's another plug for the value that the sexual harassment policy in Trinidad and Tobago provides. It's laid out within the policy, the case law, and these pieces of legislation in more detail. And I really urge you to check the Ministry of Labour's website and reach out to the Conciliation, Advisory and Advocacy Unit to provide us assistance in regard to implementing this policy and helping to address the issue at the workplace. So, thank you all very much to the audience, but most importantly to the panelists that we have this morning. We have had the benefit of learning from not just strong women, but a strong man also. Sometimes we need to start these conversations not just as something that we do for a day, but we need to start them and continue them. And from all of our panelists, you can hear the passion in their voice and the value they see in us continuing to discuss rights at work, the right to a workplace free from violence and harassment, regardless of your gender. I know it's International Women's Day, but that's a right that belongs to all of us at the workplace or workspace. And the panelists who all espouse the importance and value that ILO conventions can provide to us, whether we have ratified them or not, and also the recommendations. So without anything further, I hand you over to Dr. Henry and bid you a good day.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta. I just want to pay special tribute to Sangeeta for an exceptional job. I forgot in introducing Sangeeta to mention one of her most important professional endeavors, which is as an adjunct faculty at Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. I also want to say thank you again to the panelists, to the President of the Industrial Court, who has made herself and proved herself to be a dear friend of the college and a warrior for social justice. I know that President Thomas Felix has another engagement today on International Women's Day, and I thank you very much, ma'am, for spending some time with us. Our friend Sandra Messiah is a renowned fighter for social justice in the Caribbean, and my colleague Ian Daniel is one that we value very highly. Just a couple quick things. Two things have come out that speak about some of the things that we are focusing on at the college. One of them is the interest in the care economy and what the care economy means in the region. And we propose in the not too distant future to have a discussion about the care economy and to marry that with a discussion on CE 189 on domestic workers. And I think that is something that you can look forward to. But for me, the biggest announcement I want to make today is that some of you, Sangeeta, in introducing the President of the Industrial Court, would have made reference to the recently released book on labor law in the Commonwealth Caribbean. And I am very pleased to let you know that President Thomas Felix has agreed to collaborate with us, and we will be delivering a webinar series starting next month, where we would take different chapters or different themes from that very important book, and we would have the benefit of delving deeply into them. So, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, and especially those of you who are listening across the Caribbean, thank you for spending time with Cipriani College. And to the women who have made us, all of us, thank you and God bless you.